Hello. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about British Romanticism. In order to put this subject into context, it is necessary to discuss the preceding literary movement, Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism lasted from roughly 1660 to the late 1700s. The neoclassical period is associated with many of the most famous British authors, including Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. And it is necessary to place these neoclassical authors in comparison with Romantic authors in order to understand the revolutionary changes that were brought about in literature and in the ways that humans perceive and interact with the world that Romanticism brought about. And in many ways, the revolutions in morals and sensibilities that the Romantics brought are still very much alive today. So it's necessary to compare what came out of the Romantics to what existed during the neoclassical times to understand this shift and how it came about. So for the neoclassicists, and again, I'm going to have to make very broad stereotypes, and even with the Romantic movement, it is incredibly diverse, so I'm going to hope to simplify things as much as possible. But for the neoclassicists, they very much stress the importance of reason, common sense, and moderation, and humility. The neoclassicists drew their intellectual and philosophical models on classical Greek and Roman thinkers. They especially admired the philosophy of Aristotle, who preached the idea of the golden mean, that between two extremes is where we find virtue, and that vice comes from acting in the extreme. So, for example, between acting rashly and between acting cowardly, which are both vices, we can be properly proud. And this idea of moderation will be very important as a neoclassical ethic, and one that the Romantics will rebel against for reasons I will discuss later. Probably within the British tradition, the best proponent of neoclassicism is Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, his poetry to me is something that is a marvel. He writes in what are called closed rhyming couplets. He's very easy to quote because his poetry is written in a very restrained, classical manner. You can even see in his poetry how restrained it is through his closed couplets and the amount of art it takes to produce this form. So briefly, before I get into Romanticism, I would like to discuss Alexander Pope and the Romantic reaction to some of the ideas that we find in Pope. So to begin, I would like to discuss Pope's An Essay on Man, epistle number 2, and how this represents the general neoclassical worldview. Many critics, when looking at neoclassicism, often like to use the metaphor of a well-tended garden. For the neoclassicist, beauty exists not in nature uncontrolled, not in nature unrestrained, not in wild nature, but in nature tended and controlled and conceived by the art of man. So the classical British garden, well organized, with everything in its proper place, is considered an apt metaphor for the neoclassical worldview of using art to control nature, and then through man's interaction with controlling nature, transforming nature into something beautiful. With Alexander Pope, we see a strong impulse towards satire. Satire is one of the defining genres of the neoclassical period. Alexander Pope's satire is gentle mockery. You have to remember that during this time in the 17th, 18th century, many changes are taking place in Britain and in Europe as a whole. The discovery of the Americas has created a new rising and wealthy middle class demanding political power, and new discoveries in science are questioning old truths about religion and traditional morals, as well as the relationship between the king and the citizenry. And Alexander Pope and many other neoclassicists are concerned with what they see as the growing enthusiasm or the growing fanaticism or the growing passions that they see in people. And they want to remind people and stress the virtues of moderation, of tolerance, and of calm, rational thinking. And we see this in Alexander Pope's poem, An Essay on Man. So I'd like to begin just by reading some lines from the poem and discussing them. Pope writes, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man." So at this time, Alexander Pope is seeing many people begin to question the traditional religions and the traditional structures of society. With these lines, he is admonishing people that they are not to question the heavens, that this knowledge is beyond human nature, and to exceed human nature is to become something vile. The most important study that a human can undertake is to understand himself and to understand mankind and mankind's relationship with the universe. To go beyond this is to exceed the natural bounds that God has set as a limitation upon humanity, and to do so is something monstrous akin to the pride of Satan challenging and questioning God. He goes on to write, "Placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, with too much knowledge for the skeptic's side, with too much weakness for the stoic's pride, he hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, in doubt his mind or body to prefer, born but to die, and reasoning but to err. Alike in ignorance, his reason such, whether he thinks too little or too much." So Alexander Pope here is stressing the limitations of human reason and of human accomplishment and achievement. Again, for the neoclassicists, moderation, rationality, and calm reflection are the principal enjoyments of humankind. There is a deep love of calm leisure. You can just imagine people drinking tea, having leisurely conversations about life. Very much an aristocratic tone is set in the neoclassical period. During the neoclassical times, many of the poets were aristocrats or concerned with aristocratic values. Even Alexander Pope, although he was a Catholic, he staunchly supported his friends who were supporters of the British monarchy. And looking at other neoclassicists like Alexander Swift, they are constantly mocking through their satires different changes that are taking place in society. When we look at Swift's Gulliver's Travels, for example, there is an entire section that is dedicated to mocking science. And it's funny to read today with the triumph of science and things like this. But it's very important to understand that the neoclassicists were very much rooted in traditional conservative, aristocratic landowning interests, and this is reflected in their art and their poetry. And they're concerned with an organized society that is neither that does not go to extremes, that stays moderate, that stays conservative, and preserves traditions. The Romantic period will come during a time of revolution. Many scholars will mark the Romantic period as beginning with around the time of the French Revolution. So not only were the politics in Europe changing and becoming more radical, but with the French Revolution and the ideas that fed into it, created a new movement in poetry and in art, which is called Romanticism. And again, this shift is something that Alexander Pope and other neoclassicists see at the time, and you see them comment on in poems such as Alexander Pope's Essay on Man, in which he tries to define the proper station, the proper sphere of intellectual and moral activity for mankind. And this reasoned, balanced, classical approach towards man's position in the universe and our proper attitude towards it will be challenged by the Romantics. And this is something that I wish to explore in the next video.